Well, thank you very much for inviting me and including me in this fantastic conference. It's been such a great morning. Maybe when celebration happens for 40 years, there'll be a 10th work group, which will be social and behavioural sciences. We'll see. That would be wonderful. A lot of what we've heard this morning is actually about the need for behaviour change and how difficult it is to bring about behaviour change. So what I want to do is just give a glimpse in this time I have of taking a systematic approach to thinking about behaviour in its context and how to enable change. I'm director of the Centre for Behaviour Change at UCL. This is just something about all of the things we do, very multidisciplinary. It absolutely depends on bringing different disciplines together to understand what needs to happen and, as we've heard, translating that into policy and practice. So I'm just quickly going to go through what behaviours, because I'm sure you're all very familiar with that. Think about whose behaviours and interdependencies, understanding behaviours in their context, and we'll present the simplest possible yet comprehensive model of behaviour. Then provide a framework for thinking about how to move from that model of behaviour to actually enabling change. And finally, end with a systems perspective. So first of all, what behaviours? So if we just take outdoor air pollution, we've heard a lot about these today, but just to go through, you can have a read. I'm not going to read it all out. Aspects of transport, of energy consumption, of waste, and of adhering to policies. And if you look at all of these require behavioural change at many different levels. Indoor air pollution, we've just heard quite a bit about that. So we've heard about ventilation, humidity, chemicals, using for cleaning, energy consumptions, etc. Whose behaviour are we talking about? You know, we've heard about the importance of including citizens, and citizens aren't a homogenous group. There's many different communities within citizens. Employees, employers, service and environmental planners, business leaders, policymakers at national and importantly local levels, politicians, and I could go on. And these groups are interconnected. So when we need to think about change of behaviours, we need to do it at individual and systems levels. And I was very struck by the talk about Venice and just how hard it is to get all these groups together and bring about change when you've got these sort of obstructions and power imbalances. So thinking about individual change and systems change, which we've heard about both this morning, sometimes you get a dichotomy and pit one against the other. And I think it's both inaccurate and unhelpful. And we need to consider people's multiple roles beyond that of an individual or consumer. I mean, sometimes people say, well, no, we just need population change, or we need organisational change. That's true, but populations and organisations are made up of individuals. You know, bricks and mortar don't change. You need the people to change. And I think Greta Thunberg said this very well. I know we need a system change rather than individual change, but you cannot have one without the other. So that's a kind of starting point for what I'm going to say. So thinking about understanding behaviours in their context. Okay, the combi model. So this is that behaviour occurs as an interaction between three necessary conditions. I was going to present you this as a thought experiment. You know, what does the C, O, and M stand for? What has to be in place for any behaviour to change? But actually, it's a memory experiment, because Ben actually used this, although he didn't contribute the model, but used this. So can you remember the three, you call them, I think, determinants of adaptation. I mean, I call them influences on any kind of behaviour. Okay, hopefully you've remembered or guessed. Okay, capability, motivation, and opportunity. Those all have to be in place. You know, it's not enough to have the knowledge and skills. People think that's sometimes enough. Just tell people. It's not enough to have the motivation too. You have to have the social and the physical opportunity to enact those behaviours. And these are part of a system itself. So by changing one, it can have positive knock-on effects on the other. And this is a way of thinking about diagnosing a problem that includes human behaviour. You know, just as you wouldn't want to go to your GP with a problem and come out with a prescription without a good observation, history-taking, formulation, diagnosis beforehand. Same with any behavioural problem. And this is a nice framework. If we want behavioural change, to what extent do we need to shift the capability, physical or psychological, the motivation, the opportunity? As I said, this is the simplest, and it's a really helpful one I found to use with policymakers. But you can get a bit more complicated. So obviously, capability is the psychological, the knowledge and skills, also the physical ability. Motivation is the kind of reflective, you know, our attitudes and our beliefs, our kind of conscious choices, the kind of top down. And we all think we're very rational in our behaviour. But actually, there's powerful, very ancient bits of our brain that have much more automatic mechanisms of behaviour that activate or inhibit our behaviour. So our emotions, our drives, our habits, you know, many of these we're not aware of, very important. And then opportunity is the physical affordances in the environment and also the social ones. And just to give you an example of where this has been used, this was thinking about the Centre for Behaviour Change did some work with the Welsh Government looking at how to bring about retrofitting of their old housing stock, so kind of picking up from the last speaker. And the recommendations included increasing installation of energy-saving home improvements. So the first thought was, or way of thinking about it, do the recommendations support people to know what is the most appropriate improvements and how to make the changes. And by people was meant government policymakers, planners, house builders, and homeowners. So all these different communities need to be thought about in terms of their behaviours and what needs to shift in terms of their capability, motivation, and opportunity. With motivation, how to help people want to make the improvements, believe in its value, and feel good about it. And opportunity, make it as easy as possible and create the expectation that is socially and morally desirable. So these are all aspects of what would be needed in this situation. And this work was done involving many different community and other groups in a kind of participatory approach to coming up with plans. So you can think about a problem, you can identify what are the behaviours, whose behaviours, what are the influences on behaviours that need to change. That's fine, you've got a good understanding. Well, how do you go from that then what needs to happen? And how many different kinds of strategies do we have in order to bring about change? So I'm going to present the behaviour change wheel. For many years, I was a consultant with the Department of Health, and they're forever coming up with frameworks. What do you think about this framework for behaviour change? And they were more or less good. You know, some of them were missing big chunks, some of them were kind of really quite incoherent. So I thought, empirical question, let's go off and see what frameworks are there out there, and do any of them tick the boxes for being comprehensive, coherent, and linked to a model of change, so we can move from understanding behaviour in its context to bringing about change. Identified 19 frameworks, and none met those criteria, and there was a lot of overlap between them. So I thought, let's synthesize them, you know, bring them together, which we did. So there are 9 general intervention types, 7 policy options, and you could link them to these combi components that I talked about. And this has been very widely used in designing interventions for sustainability and health, and actually much broader, social justice, etc. So, remind you, there's the combi. It sits in the middle of this wheel, so there's the capability, opportunity, and motivation. Okay, so here we have, if you look at the 9, the red inner wheel, these are the 9 sort of direct interventions. So starting at the top, education, persuasion, incentivization, coercion, things like fining people if they don't do something, training, enablement, things like giving information to people to, against a target to help them bring about change. Then we've got, what have we got? Modelling. This is role modelling, not statistical modelling. Environmental restructuring and restrictions. Now, those are very broad types, and across all those 9 types are more than 200 specific behaviour change techniques. And then supporting those 9 types of intervention in terms of long-term maintenance and things that authorities can do: environmental and social planning, communication and marketing, legislation, service provision, regulation, fiscal measures and guidelines. So really all those 19 frameworks we could boil down. And this sort of makes it tractable for people to work with. So if we're thinking about capability, for example, you can map from one to the other. The kind of approaches that are most likely to be useful would be education and training. In terms of motivation, it'd be persuasion, incentivization, coercion, and modelling. And an opportunity, restrictions, environmental restructuring, and enablement. So depending on what your behavioural diagnosis is, means these are the kind of strategies they'd use. You can go from these broad strategies into very specific behaviour change techniques. If you want to know more about that, this is an open access original paper. Just type in behaviour change wheel, you'll find it. We wrote a guide because so many people were wanting help. The Welsh Government commissioned the top left hand, which is the most recent guide to using this sort of approach. And this was Public Health England, in the days where there was Public Health England, who commissioned a guide. And that's on our website. And all of them are free open access, apart from the book, unfortunately. Okay, just to give an example of this being used in a very different kind of situation, so promoting gas stoves in rural Guatemala. So this was a behavioural intervention that was used using the combi model and something called the theoretical domains framework, which is just more an elaboration of the capability, opportunity, and motivation. Some of you may be familiar with this. I won't read through all the bits of the method, but if you just want to quickly read it to get an idea of what was going on. In terms of measures, they used temperature sensors on wood and gas stoves to see how much they were used, and then influence on behaviour was a questionnaire, and they used this combi model to design it at each visit. And just to give an idea of the behaviour targeted and the fact that they were using different strategies. So for the initiation of stove use and safety checking, they were using training. For recognising and avoiding smoke exposure in family members, they're using education. And for cooking with gas stove instead of wood stove, so gas is better than wood, other things are better than gas, they were using persuasion. Okay, and I want to finish off. Oh, actually, we might have lots of time for discussion. Good. Just to say something about taking a systems perspective. So I'm going to talk about a very large project that I've been involved with for, I think, the last 6 years. And that's a UCL and London School joint project called Complex Urban Systems for Sustainability and Health. And the joint PIs, Mike Davis down here from UCL and Paul Wilkinson from London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, who, brilliant colleague, fantastic guy, I'm sure many of you know him in this room, who tragically, unexpectedly died last year and has left a massive hole in so many people's projects and lives. But he was absolutely wonderful to work with. But we carry on. So the 6 cities, we had 6 cities we were working with, many different partners and stakeholders. So 2 in Europe, London and Rennes, 2 in Africa, Nairobi and Kisumu, and 2 in Kenya, and 2 in China, Beijing and Ningbo. So we had a very interdisciplinary team of scientists. On the city side, we were working with citizens, with organisations, and people involved in the built and natural environment. And then key stakeholders of policymakers, industry, and third sectors, of NGOs, etc. So just to give you one example of using a systems approach and bringing behavioural science into a systems approach. This was Kisumu in Kenya, and massive problem of solid waste, 400 tonnes of solid waste per day. Majority not taken to the main dump site, inadequate waste management, contributing to substantial GHG emissions and local health problems. And it was a very complex system involving many people, organisations, and behaviours. So we built a behavioural systems. Oh, sorry about that. I wonder if it's on a timer. When I joined Cush, when we got the funding at the beginning, there had been some systems work done, but it didn't involve humans and didn't involve human behaviour. So although it was a really good description of the problem in terms of different things related to each other, there wasn't any obvious way in terms of how do we use this in order to change human behaviour. So one of the things we've done is bring a kind of a behavioural systems mapping approach to the work, which we also used with the Welsh Government work. And what we did was had many different groups. So this is a small group, but when I have been out in Kisumu and also Nairobi, we worked with many bits of the community. And so we would have workshops that might have, say, 20 to 30 people. And we'd have different groups. So we had people from the informal settlements. We had different people from living in very other kinds of overcrowded, health-damaging situations. We had planners, we had industry, we had local government there. We had all the groups of people. And we would have them for a day or sometimes 2 days to work through their understanding the problem and show them about how things were connected up with each other. And that by solving one person's idea of solving a problem might solve that problem, but not that problem. All could have knock-on effects, either for better or worse, on other aspects of the system. So really trying to get systems thinking going throughout these groups. And in terms of like building this map, so there's one thing informally, doing it in those kind of workshops where we'd have flip charts and post-it notes and all very rich discussion that would be very helpful. But then taking it a step further was getting data from interviews with various kinds of stakeholders. For this project, we had county government, we had private waste collectors, industry representatives, academic researchers, residents groups, and NGOs. And then the interview transcripts or focus groups transcripts were coded into the actors, the groups of people, the behaviours, and the influences, i.e., where do we see signs that we need to change capability or opportunity or motivation? And what we'll do is make explicit the people, the behaviours, and influences, and find that these are really helpful tools to help engage people in systems thinking. Okay, so the sum of this kind of approach in this, and this is, you can just download it from the Centre for Behaviour Change website. And just to give you, I'm not expecting you to read all of this because it's unreadable, but just to give you a sense of, you know, what it looks like. And so the filled-in blobs there are behaviour. The ones that have got just rings are influences on behaviour, the grey ones. Okay, so to conclude, and sorry, that's been a whiz through, so do ask me questions. Firstly, the importance about thinking about individuals, communities, and going back to what Ben was talking about, communities are very different, and one needs to understand differences between as well as within communities, organisations and populations. Importance of being systematic and specific. So one of the things that one has to be able to do is to think big in terms of systems at a population level, but also need to drill down into specifics of who needs to do what, when, where, and how for it to happen. So you need to be able to move between these two different levels. Importance of using scientifically informed tools. I mean, one of the problems about behavioural science is that people don't kind of see that there's a science of behaviour. You know, I know that I can't build a bridge or perform open heart surgery, but everybody behaves and they see other people behave, and we've all got our own implicit models in our heads of, you know, what's driving behaviour, what needs to happen to change. Now, if that was fine, that would be fine, but we've heard the whole morning about how it's really hard to change behaviour. The main thing is one's got to take a systematic and a scientific, use the science, use the evidence, use the theories within behavioural science to identify the behaviours, how they relate to each other, and to move from that to designing interventions and policies. And also, you know, there's a whole issue, and again, I completely agree with what Ben was saying about the importance of co-design, of including all the people that are going to benefit or that you want to change. A, because your interventions will be a lot better because they'll be informed by people with lived experience, and B, because the process gets buy-in. They'll be more motivated and engaged to actually, you know, follow through with the recommendations in the end. And always collect data about what one's doing. Not only just do these interventions make a difference and make sure you've got decent types of design, and one can have things like step wedge designs are excellent, you can make some causal inference from that, but also the importance of having process evaluation. So you have a model of what the translational process is between the intervention and the outcome, and make sure it's measured along the way. Good, thank you very much, and I look forward to any questions. I hope we've got some time.
Thank you, Susan, for driving us in this complex issue. We have time for a few questions. I need to have another one. Done.
Excellent talk and a very important topic. I should note that upon recommendations, the US EPA just hired 12 new behavioral and social scientists because of this very important topic, and recognizing that the limits of our technology-based controls for air pollution, which do work and have worked, but there's much more to be done. I'm curious, though, about one of the challenges of this. You described, and maybe you could talk a little bit more about the Guatemala gas stove issue. There's been a very comparable effort in India, for example, with major behavioral issues around sustained use of the stoves and stove stacking, and still using both types of stoves. But I'm curious, A, what happened in that case? And then secondly, the degree to which you can do the research in a way that says, here's the place where the intervention didn't occur, and compare it to the place where the intervention did occur. And that's tricky for ethical reasons. But I'm just curious how that worked. Maybe you could talk about that specific case.
Well, on the first, I can't answer the question because I wasn't involved in the research project. I just brought it up as an illustration. And actually, I did look because it was meant to be a randomized control, a cluster randomized control trial. But it had been registered, and I couldn't find any write-up of it. So I don't know what happened there. In terms of, absolutely, one needs comparison groups if one's going to draw any causal inference. And I mentioned, because often randomized controlled trials are really difficult. I mean, they are done. There's an amazing one based on villages to do with face masks during COVID and the impact, and that was, I think, it was done somewhere in South Asia, hundreds and hundreds of villages, and they did it really well. I mean, extraordinary. So it is possible, but it's really difficult. I also mentioned stepped wedge design, which I really like, which is you don't randomize groups, but it's especially in a situation where you're rolling something out, so not everything is going to happen at the same time. And you collect data. You have to be able to have routine data collected all the way along for all the different sites. But you collect it all the way along, and then you introduce the intervention, kind of ideally in randomized, but it doesn't have to be, at different times for the different sites. And then you can see the relationship between the intervention and what's happened. I mean, we did it very successfully using, this was a hand hygiene campaign across the NHS, and we had, I think, 16 hospitals and 64 wards, and we used that design, and it's a way of, more tractable than RCTs often.
Okay, Audrey.
Thank you so much. I'm a big fan of your work, so it's great to hear you. In fact, I wrote a paper with my former PhD student, Rosie Riley, where we applied your COMBI framework to air pollution engagement. So, a big fan. So my question is about how you engage people. So most of my work is about promoting, getting people out of their cars and into walking, cycling, and public transportation. And what we find today is that there's a huge amount of disinformation, misinformation, conspiracy theories when it comes to policies that touch the car. So 15-minute neighborhoods, arguably low traffic neighborhoods. So I was wondering if your insights on how you deal with that kind of backlash, of opposition.
Yeah, interestingly, I mean, quite a lot of us have been thinking about this. I was on SAGE, the Scientific Advisory Group in Emergencies, over this last few years. And it's a huge issue also, obviously, in terms of pandemic management. And I think one of the key notions is trust. You know, people have to trust the information they're getting. And who do people trust? People trust people like them. You know, people in their communities. It may be, you know, imams. You know, it may be people that one wouldn't necessarily have thought of. And there's no shortcut, really, apart from working with communities and making sure there's an embeddedness in communities. Now, that's not easy to achieve, but there are ways in which one can work with groups who then have contacts within communities. And also, I think it's a bit of a mindset, you know, of thinking, like the only way that people are really going to be influenced if one's using influence as what one's trying to do, because obviously there's other kind of environmental restructuring, other ways in. But if you're going through trying to get to hearts and minds of people, then you need to really think about it. May be several steps and chains along the way, or links along a chain, about who is going to trust who, and how do we get those people to be giving those information. And somebody this morning talked about the importance of listening. You know, it's so important also that it's a two-way thing, that it's not just about we've got a policy and an intervention and we're going to roll it out. But if you can get partnership working, and it's a genuine partnership where you're listening and learning from the communities, then there's much less of a problem for the reasons I mentioned before. But really, we could have a whole half day on this topic, but it's so, so important. It's a bit like you can have all the wonderful technology in the world. It won't make a difference unless people engage in it. You can have the best policies and best kind of interventions, unless communities are engaged, you know, it's really going to be limited.
Yeah, the time is finishing. You know, 2 seconds.
I just quickly want to ask, from her behavioural diagnosis to intervention strategy, you said we need education and training. And I want to know, as you've worked in the Department of Health, what do you do when a government is not willing to, I believe the way to educate 68 million people might be to have a public health campaign. And what do you do if the leaders are not willing to engage to then disseminate that information to the public? And how are the public going to get motivated? Because I believe on this topic, unless you give them an alternative, like maybe let's say public transport, why would they want to get out of their cars if they don't have public transport? And as you've worked in the health department, how do you answer that question, please?
Yeah. We need about 4 days on that.
Yeah.
Brilliant question. I never worked for the Department of Health as an academic consultant to them. Yeah. But so important. And that behaviour change wheel, if I had another life, or maybe somebody else would do it, I'd like another ring around the outside of it. Because, you know, the policy was for authorities and organisations. Another ring, which is about community mobilisation. You know, that's what I'd like to do. So if anybody in the room wants to work with me on doing that, because there is evidence and science that can inform how do you mobilise communities to take on power, basically, when power is not working in the interests of people. And that's a big conversation. Involves politics too.
So we need a workshop on this.
But anyway, can I just say, Rosamond, congratulations to you for all the work you've done. You're an absolute inspiration. So thank you very much. And I'd like to clap you.